WCW really did take its fans on a roller coaster throughout its history. Its incredible highs and absurd lows have become a permanent part of wrestling folklore, and many of those were tied up in the lineage of the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. 22 men held the title from its inception in 1991, lasting over a decade until it was finally unified with the WWF title at Vengeance 2001. That group is made up of an extremely varied selection of wrestlers, and one or two non-wrestlers as well. From muscle-bound superheroes to despicable heels, company loyalists to WWE defectors, the history of the championship takes us on a journey through wrestling at its very best and worst. But rather than sitting back and enjoying its lineage at face value, we're going to brutally rank each champion in list form. It's what we do here. It's what fuels our life force. I'm Adam Pacitti from Cultaholic.com, and this is every single WCW World Heavyweight Champion ranked from worst to best. Join us. Number 22. Vince Russo. I mean, obviously. How could we place Vince Russo anywhere other than the bottom of this list? Imagine the head writer of your favorite TV show becoming an actual on-screen figure. Not a cameo role as one of the characters, imagine them actually playing themselves, acknowledging to the audience that everything beforehand was scripted. Now imagine them becoming the most powerful figure on the show, making all of your favorite characters seem pathetic and stupid as a result. That is exactly what happened when WCW booker Vince Russo won the gold in September 2000. In a steel cage match against Booker T, Russo was speared through the cage wall by an interfering Goldberg, thereby becoming heavyweight champion of the goddamn world. This was such a disastrous, egotistical booking decision, it's hard to know where to begin criticizing it. WCW had already jumped the shark by this stage, but this was a whole new level. Russo didn't even have the decency to drop the title to an actual wrestler. He vacated it a week later because you've obviously got to keep your head writer strong. That's Wrestling 101. Number 21, David Arquette. Just a quick disclaimer here, David Arquette seems like a decent guy and a genuinely passionate wrestling fan. He's since expressed regret for what we're about to discuss and has even forged an indie wrestling career for himself in recent years, tussling with the likes of Colt Cabana, Jungle Boy, and terrifying bleedy deathmatch thug Nick Gage. He also provides the voice of Eddie in SSX Tricky for the PS2. What a guy. However, with all that said, David Arquette should never, ever have become WCW World Heavyweight Champion. In 2000, yes, that was a pretty magical year for WCW, as you might have already guessed, the promotion decided to put their belt on the star of Ready to Rumble. This was a very flawed idea, not just because it was a shameless publicity grab, but also because of the manner in which the title change was carried out. Arquette teamed with reigning champion DDP to take on Jeff Jarrett and Eric Bischoff, with the stipulation that whoever made the pinfall would win the title. If only we realized quite how literal this rule was. Arquette pinned Bischoff, and despite the champ being his own partner, the referee decided that this meant he had won the gold. Arquette held the belt for 12 days, carrying it into the super triple double hardcore mega cage of doom match at Slamboree. That's its real name, I promise. Don't Google it and spoil the magic. There, Arquette turned heel, attacking DDP and allowing Jarrett to win the gold. They'd been buddies all along. Who'da thunk it? The answer is anybody who has ever watched a Russo-era WCW show. Number 20, Chris Benoit. Benoit is always tricky to rank for obvious reasons, but even trickier here because he did almost nothing with the WCW Championship. The Canadian won the vacant title at Sold Out 2000, there's that magical year again, and left for Titan Towers the very next day. Benoit was originally scheduled to wrestle Jeff Jarrett in a triple threat theatre series, but an injury to Double J moved Benoit to the main event. There he began his glorious one-day reign by submitting Sid, although Sid's foot was under the ropes and special guest referee Arn Anderson missed it, because we're talking about the late days of WCW here. Hours later, Benoit left for WWF alongside Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, and Perry Saturn. We can probably chalk that one up as a loss for WCW in the Monday Night Wars. Number 19, Kevin Nash. Oh boy, here we go. Kevin Nash is one of the biggest names in WCW history, a founding member of the NWO and a 4-time champion. Well, a 5-time champion unofficially, but one of his reigns isn't recognized. Booker T is probably very pleased about that. This all might have led you to believe that Nash would be much higher on this list. You would be wrong. Very wrong. Despite Despite his multiple reigns, Nash held the title for under 100 days, a testament to the jumbled mess that was the WCW main event scene at the time. They weren't uneventful reigns either. Despite holding the belt for a short amount of time, Nash packed a career's worth of controversy into just a few months. He first won the championship in infamous fashion, snapping Goldberg's legendary undefeated streak with the help of Scott Hall and a cattle prod. It was a gigantic title change, one which needed a gigantic payoff. That payoff was the finger poke of doom. Nash voluntarily dropped the belt to Hogan, making the world title look like nothing more than a plaything for the cool heels of the day, which essentially it was. His other reigns followed a similar pattern, Nash winning the belt from a younger or more popular star, only to drop it a very short while later. As commissioner, he even once stripped the title from Sid, awarded it to himself, and dropped it back to Sid the same night. Do you have a headache yet? I do. At a time when WCW was struggling to stay afloat, and title changes seemed to happen as often as tag matches, Nash really did feel like a disruptive presence, breaking up the reigns of people like Sid, Booker, and Jarrett for no good reason. Number 18, Bret Hart. When Bret Hart crossed the Great Divide, still seething in the aftermath of a Montreal screwjob, he could have been the man that put the final nail in the WWF's coffin. WCW were winning the ratings war and had just robbed Vince McMahon of one of his biggest stars. But despite a history of scoring wins over dangerous opponents from Yokozuna to Stone Cold Steve Austin, there was one foe the Hitman couldn't overcome: the WCW booking team. Bret didn't win the title until 2 years after he switched sides, which is pretty astonishing when you think about it. By that point, his character had been reduced to a confusing, inconsistent mess. Was he heel? Was he face? Would he be helping the NWO this week, or would he be fighting against them? We're still struggling to figure it out, to be honest. Bret eventually won the title at Mayhem 99, the culmination of a tournament featuring Sting, Jarrett, Benoit, and the Hitman himself. On the surface, that sounds like a damn good lineup, but you're forgetting one thing. This was the Vince Russo era. One-time WCW champion Vince Russo, excuse me. Dustin Rhodes screwed Jarrett in one semi-final, and Lex Luger cost Sting in the other. The final between Hart and Benoit featured run-ins from Goldberg, Hall, Nash, and Dean Malenko. I am exhausted. Bret lost the belt after a rehash of the Montreal screwjob, because we all love those. He defeated Goldberg at Starrcade 99 after Roddy Piper called for the bell, but honorably vacated the title the next night on Nitro. Then, that same night, he won the rematch by turning heel and aligning with Nash, Hall, and Jarrett. So why did he vacate it in the first place? I just don't understand. Why Ultimately, Bret would vacate the title again due to injury problems that would eventually end his career. But had he stayed healthy, what are the chances of him being booked in a strong and sensible way? You know the answer already, don't you? Number 17, Sid Vicious. Throughout the history of WCW, champions have lost their title in weird ways, like being zapped by a cattle prod or taking a dive after your best friend pokes you in the chest. Sid fell victim to one of these bizarre incidents in the belt's lineage, and had he just, been pinned by another wrestler, he'd probably be a few places higher on this list. More on that in a moment. Sid first won the WCW Championship in January 2000, defeating both Harris brothers in a qualifying match, and then Kevin Nash. Then Nash stripped it from him because he'd pinned the wrong Harris brother. No, I'm not making this up, please try to stay calm. Then Sid won it back that very same night. It gets worse. In his second reign, Sid actually defended the title for a couple of months. I know, we can't believe it either. He even looked to be heading into a title feud with the returning Hulk Hogan. Instead, Russo and Bischoff seized control of the company, hitting the reset button in the process. And by hitting the reset button, I mean they actually rebooted WCW, stripping all of the champions of their belts, including Sid and his WCW championship. So Sid embarked on a revenge mission to get back the gold he never lost, right? No, he didn't. And that's it, on to the next entry. Number 16, Kurt Angle. As you may have guessed from the tone of this video so far, we're not fans of WCW at the turn of the century. We can only think of one person who genuinely is, and his name rhymes with Mince Musso. The dying days of WCW featured some of the worst title reigns in company history, which explains why Kurt Angle ranks pretty highly here. Yes, he only held the title for a few days in the midst of the invasion angle, but unlike the reigns of those below him, at least it all made sense. That's all we're asking for at this point. We just want it to make sense. Angle's reign may have been a short one, but at least it was historically significant, as he became the first wrestler in the invasion to bring the WCW title over to the the WWF locker room. He won and lost the belt to Booker T, and both matches featured a lot of extra brawling between members of the WWF and the Alliance. It felt like a small skirmish in a much larger war, but at least it was entertaining. Number 15, Jeff Jarrett. Like many on this list, Jarrett's time with the Gold was warped and mangled by the black hole that was WCW in the year 2000. He won the belt 4 times, and you could sense that amongst all the insane storylines and rapid title changes, there was an old-school NWA-style heel champion desperate to get out. Jarrett really made the most of his heelish persona and could always be relied upon to have a solid match in the ring, which has bumped him up a few places here. In a different time, he could have been an effective WCW champion, and it occasionally seemed like the company wanted that to happen too. But then they'd get bored and totally rob him of any momentum. They'd do things like have him lie down for Hogan at Bash at the Beach 2000, or rely on the help of a heel turn from Kimberly Page. What's that? Jarrett's held the belt for 8 whole days? Quick, let's get Ric Flair to roll him up on Nitro. We have no idea what we're doing, but we're having a great time. Number 14, Randy Savage. Na Randall Sav, Randall Sav. Randy Savage may have been the unluckiest WCW champion of all time if we combine the worlds of kayfabe and reality. Let's call it kayfality. The Macho Man won the title 4 times, and even though the quality of each reign differed, they all had one thing in common. They ended in sad and unfortunate fashion. Let's take a look. Savage first won the belt at World War III in 1995, last eliminating one-man gang from a huge 3-ringed battle royal. Of course, this wouldn't be wrestling if Hulk Hogan didn't steal Randy's moment, and that's exactly what he did here, complaining for ages about his unfair elimination from the match. Terry, you're one of the most decorated and protected figures in wrestling history, let it go. Savage lost the title to Flair thanks to interference from the new 4 horsemen, Flair, Arn, Brian Pillman, and Chris Benoit. But hey, that's just one of those things that happens in wrestling. If you're a babyface champion in the South, you're probably going to run afoul of the horsemen at some stage. It happens to everyone. But Savage's next reign also ended in unfortunate circumstances when Elizabeth defected to Flair's side at Super Brawl 6. Did WrestleMania 8 mean nothing to you, Liz? His third reign was over before it began, as he tore his ACL en route to winning the title from Sting. The injury happened because Hogan pushed him off the top rope, and if that isn't a metaphor for Savage's entire career, I don't know what is. He dropped the gold on Nitro the following night, Hogan and Nash were at each other's throats, and the NWO Civil War began. Macho Man's final reign came in 1999 with Team Madness running wild. By the way, Team Madness was a stable featuring the classic lineup of Savage, Sid, Medusa, Molly Holly, and Gorgeous George. The female Gorgeous George, not the wrestling icon of the 40s and 50s. Anyway, Savage dropped the belt to Hogan the night after winning it. Couldn't we have given the guy a break, WCW? He'd been through enough. Number 13, Scott Steiner. As we all know, nothing is finer than Scotty Steiner, apart from the 11 better champions on this list, but that's okay. Steiner's a strange one. Well, we know that already, but he's also a strange one in the context of the title's lineage. There were 25 WCW title changes in the year 2000, so when Big Papa Pump won the gold in November, it was almost a relief to see him hold it until the following March. No vacancies, no reboots, no Kevin Nash awarding the belt to himself, just stability. Infuriating, never winning clean, interference-ridden stability. As paradoxical as it sounds, Steiner had a calming influence over the WCW title scene in the company's dying days. He overcame the likes of Sid, Jarrett, and DDP, often with the help of the Magnificent Seven stable. It wasn't the best run in terms of booking or match quality, but it was certainly a lot better than we'd seen for the past year or two, and that has to count for something, right? Steiner dropped the title in remarkably straightforward fashion, losing to Booker T in just 5 minutes on the final ever Nitro. It was a quick loss, one which perhaps could have been built up to mean more, but at least it was the right decision. Number 12, Diamond Dallas Page. DDP was one of the most beloved stars in WCW, and really, he was given the title far too late. None of Page's 3 reigns lasted very long at all, but the first includes one of the best matches in Nitro history. Having turned heel while holding the gold, DDP squared off against Sting in a genuinely compelling bout. Sting picked up the victory, but Page won it back later that night in a 4-way match, because in the latter years of WCW, even the good stuff couldn't escape being overbooked. He lost the belt to Nash at Slamboree, a match between a heelish babyface and a face-ish heel, but the babyface won, of course, and everybody was sad, I think. I'm confused. DDP enjoyed one last reign with the title, but accidentally dropped it to David Arquette, which mercifully we've already talked about in this video. You don't have to hear about it again, it's all going to be okay. Interlude time! If you watched our ranking of every WWE champion, you'll know that we jammed a big intrusive maths lesson right in the middle of our lovely list. Well, hold on to your hats because we're doing it all over again. If the average WCW champion was an actual person, he'd have had 3 reigns for a combined total of 176 days. He'd be 6'3" and would absolutely be from the continent of North America. Yes, all 22 of our WCW champions are from that part of the world, with 19 from the States and the other 3 hailing from the Great White North. Our average champion would have a 45% chance of also holding the WWE title at some stage in his career, and a 4.5% chance of voicing a character in an early 2000s snowboarding video game. Thanks, Arquette. Back to the list. Number 11, Chris Jericho. There will be WCW fans out there angry at us for placing Chris Jericho this high on the list. In fact, I can hear Matthew's blood boiling from here. Yes, Y2J's 2 title reigns came after the demise of WCW itself, and his first was a part of the widely disliked Invasion angle. He also didn't hold the title for very long, about 2 weeks in fact. But there are several things working in Jericho's favor as a great WCW champion, so please allow us to explain. Y2J was one of the biggest unsung heroes of WCW, a talented and hilarious member of the undercard who was never allowed to rise to the level he deserved. It was therefore great to see him win the belt at No Mercy 2001, defeating The Rock in a fantastic match, one of the best in the title's entire history. He lost it back to The Rock 2 weeks later, snapping and attacking the People's Champ in a great character moment. His second reign came after the Invasion had died down in a one-night tournament to unify the WCW and WWF titles. At Vengeance, Y2J defeated The Rock and Steve Austin in one night to become the first ever undisputed champion. Sadly, this did end the lineage of the WCW title, but we can't think of a more fitting final champion. Number 10, The Giant. Were it not for his second stint with the gold, The Giant would be somewhere near the bottom of this list. His initial reign was one of the silliest moments in company history, which began when he defeated Hulk Hogan in his in-ring debut. But to say The Giant defeated the Hulkster only tells a tiny fraction of the story. Manager Jimmy Hart turned on Hogan, attacking the referee to get his friend DQ'd, which allowed The Giant to become champion, because for some reason, disqualification was later revealed to be a valid method of winning the belt in this match. Things only got more ridiculous from there. The Giant was then joined by the Yeti, and the pair decimated Hogan with a brutal double bear hug. Won't somebody please think of the children? Also, the Giant did all this having fallen off an actual building earlier in the night. Also, he was stripped of the title 1 week later because WCW decided that the title changing hands via DQ wasn't okay after all. Also, the Yeti was an actual mummy! Mercifully, the future Big Show's second reign was a lot better. He shockingly defeated Ric Flair on an April 96 Nitro, a title change that was very well received by the crowd. He went on to beat Sting at Slamboree and Lex Luger at the Great American Bash, and even defended the title in a few matches in Japan as well. Despite being a legitimately menacing monster champion, Show's reign was cut short thanks to the arrival of the New World Order. He dropped the title to Hogan at Hog Wild, a sad ending, but an understandable one given the groundbreaking nature of the NWO storyline. Number 9, Lex Luger. Poor Lex Luger only seemed to be champion when all the fans wanted someone else to be. He was WCW's big, blonde, muscular silver medal. Lex was actually the second man ever to hold the WCW Championship, beating Barry Windham for the vacated title at the 1991 Great American Bash. His victory was a tainted one, with the fans chanting for Ric Flair. The Nature Boy was out of the company after his infamous argument with Executive Vice President Jim Herd and had taken the big gold gold belt with him. Despite holding the title for 230 days, Luger actually didn't defend it very often. He sat out the end of the year due to contract disputes, came back to wrestle Masahiro Chono in Tokyo, and returned to the sidelines until Super Brawl in February. There he dropped the belt to Sting, pre-Crow Sting, Surfer Sting, Happy Sting. Luger's second reign was another case of being the wrong man in the right place and time. I'll set the scene. It's August 1997. Hogan and the NWO have held the title for almost a year, and everything's being set up for Sting to win it back. Instead, on the Nitro before Road Wild, Luger shocks the world and beats Hogan out of absolutely nowhere. Roll the credits. It made for a huge jubilant moment, sure, but the wider picture wasn't quite as good. Lex dropped the belt back to Hogan at Road Wild, making Sting's eventual triumph a lot less impactful. Well, it was actually one of many reasons Sting's win wasn't great. We'll get to that later. Ultimately, Luger was a victim of circumstance in both of his title reigns, but at least he was a part of some important moments in the belt's history. Good effort. Number 8, The Rock. Like Chris Jericho and Kurt Angle, The Rock only held the WCW Championship once the promotion itself was 6 feet under. It's generally accepted that the invasion angle was a bad thing. The lack of major WCW stars, the DDP Stalker angle, Stephanie and Shane leading the alliance, a lot of it missed the mark in a major way. However, there were a few lonely bright spots, and one of those has to be The Rock's time as WCW champion. The Brahma Bull defeated Booker T at SummerSlam 2001, a big feel-good sports entertainment main event. Yes, it wasn't the most WCW thing in the world, but The Rock's charisma and star quality helped a great deal. He went on to beat Booker and Shane McMahon in a handicap match at Unforgiven, notable for Shane not winning despite being the best wrestler in the world. Very bold booking indeed. The Great One then lost the title to Y2J in a barn burner at No Mercy, won it back in an entertaining rematch on Raw, and carried the belt into Survivor Series where he vanquished the Alliance once and for all. Rock took part in the aforementioned tournament to unify both world titles, losing the title to Y2J in the semi-final. Despite not being a name you'd automatically associate with the WCW Championship, there's no denying that The Rock's time with the title was consistently strong, packing a lot of quality into a relatively short period. Number 7, Ron Simmons. There are various impressive ways to secure a world title shot. Winning the Royal Rumble, for example, or pinning the champion in non-title action. One of the least rock and roll methods was employed by Ron Simmons in 1992 when he won a raffle. No, I'm not making that up. He became #1 contender by winning a pissing raffle. However, despite winning a title shot in the same way you might win a copy of Cluedo, what happened next was truly historic. On an August show in Baltimore, Maryland, Simmons slipped out of a Vader bomb and hit the champion with one hell of a power slam, pinning him to become the 5th WCW champion. Even more significantly, with this victory, Simmons is often recognized as the first ever African-American world champion in pro wrestling. After defeating Vader, he held the title for a few months, defending it against the likes of the Barbarian and Dr. Death Steve Williams. He lost it back to the former champ in December, capping a reign that might not rank among the greatest ever, but certainly among the most historically significant. We often see Simmons as a punchline these days, crashing backstage comedy segments to say his catchphrase, but that just makes it easy to forget that in the early 90s, he was a truly groundbreaking figure. Number 6, Goldberg. Well, it was fun while it lasted. The rise of Goldberg was one of the most electrifying things to ever happen to WCW, and while his one title reign started off well, it's often remembered nowadays as a tale of wasted potential. We all know about Goldberg's legendary undefeated streak, and the culmination of that was his victory over Hulk Hogan in the summer of 1998. The shaven-headed babyface decimated the leader of the NWO in the Georgia Dome, winning the WCW title in the biggest moment in Nitro history. He then moved into a well-received feud with DDP, the high point of which was a great match at Halloween Havoc, perhaps the best of Goldberg's entire career. Of course, all good things must come to an end, although maybe not as abruptly or horribly as this title reign. Goldberg faced Kevin Nash at Starrcade and lost in controversial fashion as Scott Hall zapped him with a bloody cattle prod. Now you could argue that everybody loses sooner or later and that Goldberg's streak couldn't be expected to go on forever. On the other hand, it led to the finger poke of doom, so it might not have been worth it. Looking back, it's strange to think that despite being one of the biggest names in company history, Goldberg only ever held the WCW title once and for such a relatively short amount of time. A fun and exciting time, sure, but one that should have lasted a lot longer. Number 5, Booker T. Yes, we all know that Booker T is a 5-time WCW champion, and no, I'm not going to actually say it 5 times because this video's long enough already. But a less discussed part of Booker's career is the nature of those reigns. It's painful to admit, but there's no way Booker would have been a 5-time champion were it not for the frantic booking of WCW's main event scene. He at least ended the Bash at the Beach debacle on an optimistic note, defeating Jeff Jarrett for the vacant title after Hogan's departure. After playing hot potato with Kevin Nash, he then lost to Vince Russo, which we covered at the start of this video and don't want to talk about ever again. But don't worry, because Booker got his hands on the gold again, defeating Jarrett in a San Francisco 49ers match. What's a San Francisco 49ers match, you ask? 4 boxes were suspended above the ring, one containing the WCW title, the other 3 containing weapons. Those weapons were an inflatable sex doll, a coal miner's glove, and a framed photo of Scott Hall. We don't actually know what this has to do with the San Francisco 49ers. The show was in San Francisco, which is reason enough, I guess? Anyway, Booker won the match after interference from Beetlejuice. Not that Beetlejuice, this Beetlejuice. Although, if it had been the other Beetlejuice, would you really have been surprised? Let's not forget that RoboCop once appeared in WCW to save his best buddy Sting. The point we're getting at here is that Booker had to overcome a lot of idiocy to become an effective champion, and despite everything around him being totally stupid, he actually came across very well. His latter reigns were mercifully more straightforward than the first few, as he defeated Scott Steiner in a feel-good moment on the last ever Nitro before carrying the belt into the WWF. Alongside RVD, he was one of the only incoming wrestlers to actually be treated as an uppercard star, clashing with the likes of Austin, The Rock, and Kurt Angle. Nicely done, Booker. Number 4, Hollywood Hulk Hogan. Oh boy, here we go. Hulk Hogan is the hardest champion to place on this list. He's unquestionably an iconic part of WCW history, a key figure of their time atop the wrestling world, and the spearhead of one of the most revolutionary storylines of all time. On the other hand, he also took part in a lot of very, very stupid stuff, often as WCW champion. To paint an accurate picture of Hogan with the title, we need to break this down into stages. Hogan won the title from Ric Flair in his debut match at Bash at the Beach 94, bringing Hulkamania to WCW, brother. Or rather, a largely unwelcome reboot of Hulkamania, which was never a great fit for an industry rapidly developing a new attitude. Hogan reigned supreme for over a year, the longest title reign in the belt's history, defending it against the likes of Flair, Vader, and The Butcher, aka his best buddy, Brutus Beefcake. He eventually lost it to the Giant at Halloween Havoc thanks to a Jimmy Hart heel turn, and of course, the monstrous Yeti. Now a monochrome heel leading the hottest stable in wrestling, Hogan cheated to win the title back at Hog Wild. This led to perhaps the most famous WCW title reign ever, complete with spray-painted belt, babyfaces defecting to the NWO, and a legendary rivalry with Sting. In ring, Hogan didn't actually defend the title that often given the length of his reign, but the angle propelled both the NWO and WCW to the top of the wrestling world. After a brief feud with Lex Luger, Hogan lost the belt to Sting at Starrcade 97, which sounds like a good blow-off match, but actually wasn't. We'll explain a little later on. Now, fast-forwarding to spring 1998, the NWO was falling apart at the seams. With Civil War looming, a jealous Hogan defeated new champion Randy Savage on Nitro with the help of unlikely ally Bret Hart. That didn't really make sense, but his monumental loss to Goldberg thankfully did. The sensible booking strategy now would be for the aging Hogan to slowly fade, allowing Goldberg to lead the company into a new era, right? Well, yes, that would have been sensible, but instead we got the finger poke of doom. Thankfully, Hogan only held the title for a couple of months before losing it to hungry up-and-comer Ric Flair. Now onto our final stage. Having been out of the title picture for about 4 months, a lifetime in the latter days of WCW, Hogan returned as a face to challenge heel champion Randy Savage. He won the belt, of course, and brought back the Hulkamania shtick for a big, slow victory over Kevin Nash at Road Wild. He then did what any logical champion would do and lay down against Sting for no reason. And finally, with the completion of his last officially recognized reign, Hogan went back to his home planet and was never seen again.
I have to go now. My planet needs me.
Can you see why we didn't know where to rank him? Number 3, Sting. Like Hogan, Sting's title reigns featured many ups and downs. Unlike Hogan, most of the negatives weren't really Sting's fault. In fact, had he been champion as often as he probably deserved, the Stinger could well have been number 1 on this list. Sting was one of the very early champions of WCW, defeating Lex Luger for the gold at Super Brawl 2. He carried the belt into a feud with the Dangerous Alliance, which featured a now legendary War Games match and enjoyed a famous rivalry with Vader as well. Sting had far worse luck throughout the mid-90s and just couldn't seem to get his hands on the title again. But finally, he reinvented himself, harnessing the power of Goth to topple a dominant Hogan at Starrcade 97. It should have been huge, a beloved babyface scoring a massive victory over the New World Order, but it wasn't. Let's explain why. The plan was this. Hogan was supposed to win thanks to a fast count by referee Nick Patrick, only for Bret Hart to come out and demand a restart, after which Sting would secure victory. That's sort of what happened, except Patrick's fast count wasn't fast at all. It was completely normal. This made the company's top babyface look like a lucky opportunist, and the top heel seemed to have been screwed out of the title. Oh dear. Sting was stripped of the title a few days later, and his latter reigns never hit the heights they should have. There were bright spots, such as the excellent Nitro match with DDP, but by and large, Sting never became the iconic champion he should have been. One of the best in WCW history, sure, but it could have been even better. Number 2, Big Van Vader. If there's one thing we've learned from this list, it's that with WCW, you often have to take the good with the bad. With that in mind, we are so relieved to talk about a champion whose reigns were remarkably consistent. Take a bow, Vader, you big, massive bastard. Vader's first taste of gold came with a brutal win over Sting at the 1992 Great American Bash, before injury forced his reign to be cut short. Even that was handled well, as he dropped the belt to Ron Simmons in a now iconic title switch. Vader got his revenge 5 months later, returning from injury and taking the belt back from Simmons. He resumed his feud with Sting on an overseas tour in 1993, losing and regaining the title in London and Dublin respectively. Presumably, the Irish air did him some good. Much of the rest of 93 saw Vader embroiled in a brutal feud with Cactus Jack, including broken noses, power bombs on concrete, and a fantastic death match at Halloween Havoc. Throughout all of this, Vader clung to the gold, only to lose it to Ric Flair in a dramatic title versus career match at Starrcade. It has been such a relief to talk about this without any convoluted NWO shenanigans or Russo written nonsense. For being a consistently great champion backed by sensible booking, Vader makes it to number 2 on our list. Thank God for that. Number 1, Ric Flair. To be the man, you gotta beat the man. And to be the greatest WCW champion ever, you have to hold it 8 times for over 500 combined days. Fortunately for Ric Flair, that's exactly what he did, although it wasn't always smooth sailing. Like Hogan and Sting, the Nature Boy's consistent standing at the top of the card meant he took part in some incredibly dodgy storylines. Flair's career is inextricably linked to the history of the WCW Championship. After winning the NWA title from Sting in 1991, WCW began recognizing him as their first champion too. He lost the NWA belt to Tatsumi Fujinami, but kept his WCW title due to the rules and governing bodies and all that fun stuff. Fujinami threw him over the top rope at one stage, and apparently that was too far for the WCW boys. "You will never be our champion, Fujinami," they said. "Now give Rick his belt back before he flies home, please." Soon after, the Nature Boy fell out with Jim Herd and took the big gold belt to the WWF. It sounds like extremely unprofessional behavior, but when you learn that Herd wanted to rename Flair Spartacus and have him wear a diamond earring, it sort of becomes more understandable. Flair returned to WCW in 1993 and stayed with the company until the bitter end. In that time, he took part in countless memorable feuds over the gold, winning it from Vader, losing it to Hogan, reforming the Four Horsemen to defeat Savage, and so on. At the turn of the century, as WCW's momentum ground to a halt, Flair's reigns became more and more convoluted. At Uncensored 99, he beat Hogan in a barbed wire steel cage first blood match, despite bleeding first, naturally. The last of his reign saw Kevin Nash simply give the belt to Flair because he felt like it, only for Jarrett to beat him later in the night. In fairness, Flair was distracted during their match, the distraction being that Vince Russo had kidnapped his family. No, seriously, that was the actual storyline. Despite these inconsistencies, Flair has to be our choice for the #1 spot. As a babyface champion, he provided his own brand of infectious enthusiasm, and as a heel, there was absolutely no one better.
Thanks for watching. Let us know what you think in the comments down below. You can follow us on Twitter at Cultaholic. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cultaholic. If you enjoy what we do here at Cultaholic, you can pledge to us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Cultaholic. And most importantly, don't forget to hit subscribe and join us.